All right, guys, welcome back to the garage. Today we're switching things up a little bit and working on a Honda. All right, what we got here is the second gen CRV, 02 to 06 CRV. I believe this was 04. And basically what we got is a noise from the transmission. Now in those videos, you can see it does it as soon as you start it up idle, and then once you put it in driver neutral, the sound will go away. But once you drive, the sound will come back, and it almost sounds like a gear noise. So I did some digging on the forums and stuff, trying to figure out if anybody else has had these kind of issues with the transmission. And I found a few good posts explaining what's going on. Now what we got here from Honda is that transmission cover plate that goes on the end of the transmission. What we got in here is this bearing, and apparently what happens is this bearing loses its fit inside the case, and then there's two transfer gears on the transmission. One of them rides in this bearing, and when this bearing comes loose, it allows the mesh between the two transfer gears on the transmission to lose their proper mesh, and that's what causes the noise. Now it turns out there's actually a technical bulletin for that noise specifically, but it only applies to the 5-speed autos from Honda. And 02 to 04 CRVs had the 4-speed. 05 and 06 had the 5-speed. But again, after all the reading and stuff I did, I'm fairly confident that this is having the exact same issue as the 5-speeds did. So let's dig in. All right, first thing we're gonna do is drain the fluid. This plug right here. Just takes a 3/8 ratchet. All right, next thing we need to do is remove the air box because we need access to the transmission mount bolts right here. I got a new one of these to replace that. And right there are the 3 bolts we need to loosen. Basically what we're gonna do is tilt the whole subframe down on the driver's side. That way we can access the end cover for the transmission, which we'll do from underneath. All right, there you can see the cover for the transmission, the end. You can see we can only access about the bottom 2/3 of the bolts. The rest are up there behind the frame rail. So that's why we gotta lower it down to get those top bolts. So basically for this side, what we'll have to do is we'll disconnect that tie rod end right there, and then come up top, remove the strut mount bolts, and then transmission mount bolts right there, those 3. Then that'll free up the driver's side of the subframe because everything sits in the subframe. Then we'll loosen the passenger side subframe bolts and actually remove the driver's side subframe bolts and tilt the whole subframe down on just this side. And we can leave all the suspension still connected. We'll undo that brake line so there's no tension on it, but it should be able to swing down far enough for us to get those bolts. Here's where we're at. I removed the splash shield just because some of those clips there go into the subframe. I just didn't want it to be in the way. So basically you just got some clips on this bottom side and the wheel wells, and then some 10mm bolts holding it in, and it comes right out. And then underneath, got the drain plug back in the transmission. Then I have the transmission supported by the jack, so we can undo the mounts up there, and then we can start doing subframe bolts. All right, again, make sure the transmission is supported by a jack. That way when you undo these bolts, the transmission doesn't fall. And these are 17 millimeters. All right, I got the passenger side subframe bolts loosened. And now let's remove the driver's side.
A few moments later.
Yeah, that one fought me. I had to run it back and forth a bunch of times to finally get it free. Mainly because of rust. All right, for some reason my phone didn't record, but I got it lowered. Now, a few notes. One, wash this brake line. I actually have a jack underneath the control arm just to relieve some of this pressure. You could remove the caliper, hang the caliper up, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. Also, you're gonna want to pull this harness off these tabs right here. Just pull up on these and it slides off. Give that some room. As far as everything else, I don't feel anything super tight. This hose kind of smashed, should be okay. And then moving on to the passenger side, you're gonna want to loosen this mount up or it will not come down far enough. So do this before you start lowering it. Along with the harness, watch your brake line. Just loosen the subframe bolts on this side. Take those two completely out. Slowly lower your jack. And there it is. It should have just enough room because this has to slide out. There's actually tubes connected to that case that slide into the transmission. So you can't just remove the bolts and then pop the cover off. It actually has to slide out like this. So you have to have room all the way around. All right, first thing we're gonna do is take this cover off. Now, make sure you keep track of your bolts. So I'm just gonna put them back where I got them. Set that off to the side. There you go. Put that back in there. All right, now we'll remove this. Okay, now we should be good to remove all the 10 millimeters, and don't forget this middle one and slide this cover off. And I forgot one more connector back here. Make sure you undo that. All right, I went ahead and transferred all my bolts to a piece of cardboard so I can keep track of them. And you notice it's a little tight at first and you kind of got to work it back and forth, but eventually she'll start moving. Just like that. And here's the trouble bearing right there. All right, now that we got this apart, I can explain this a little better. You notice this bearing was sitting on the shaft like that. Now this bearing should be pressed into this case here. And see that how sloppy of a fit that is? That's why. So it allows these two gears to mesh weird and not hold a tight mesh. And that's what causes your noise. Now also in that service bulletin, they say if you let this go on for too long, it can cause uneven wear on these gears. And even if you replace the plate with the new bearing, you can still have a little noise because of that. Now just to show you a little bit more, this bearing, I can move it inside the housing. This bearing cannot move. That's the issue. For some reason, the clearances in here allow this bearing to move just a little bit, just enough to cause that noise. So what we got to do is transfer all our parts from this one to this one. So these tubes, the sensor, and these bolts here need to go over there. And these tubes do have O-rings, so I got new O-rings just to be safe. Now I'll tighten that down once we get this cover back on. Now these two are held in by snap rings, so you need snap ring pliers to get these out. And right there's one of the O-rings we're going to replace. And inside is another one of the O-rings we're going to replace. There. Gonna put a little transmission fluid on it. Slide that on there. Put our cap back on like that. Put our big O-ring on like that. Gonna put some more fluid on it. And then these line up with notches in the case. Just make sure that O-ring stays on. Same thing, and this one, we got an O-ring on that, and then a small O-ring on the middle. We'll replace both of these. All right, got everything transferred over to my new case. I can't forget to tighten that once we get it on, but now I just need to remove this gasket. There's no sealant required, so it's just a paper gasket that sandwiches the two halves together, and we'll be good to put the new one on. All right, got my new gasket on. Getting the old gasket off kind of sucked, but it's ready to put the cover on. it's on. Let's go put the bolts in. Okay, once you got them all snug, all these will be 12 Newton meter torque, and then these three are 21 foot-pounds. All right, next we're gonna slide this back on. Now, these holes are slotted because it has to be aligned just right. I'm gonna put it back exactly where it was by using the marks the bolts left, and it should be good. Let me slide our cover back on. And then don't forget about the pressure sensor. And don't forget to plug it in. All right, now the task of putting the subframe back up. All right, I got a little ratchet strap just to help guide this strut up because it's wanting to fall and I'm by myself, so that way it'll kind of guide it up into the strut tower. And just be mindful as you start raising it up and make sure everything is where it should be. Take your time, go slow. Here we go. All right, well, I got the subframe sitting up there. I still got to put the bolts in, but just some tips. So I started lifting the subframe, and I stopped as soon as this mount lined up so I could get those bolts in. So that was the first thing. As soon as this mount lined up, I put these bolts in. Then continued to raise the cradle until the transmission mount bolts lined up, and I was able to get those in. Now, one thing that fought me was the strut. So you probably saw I took this top bolt out. That allowed it to swing in and get up there. Also, the inner joint of the axle separated, which is common. When this knuckle swings too far, it'll separate in there. So that was also fighting me. So I had to, give it a couple love taps to get that back in there. But struts in, struts bolted up. I got to do this brake line, tie rod end, subframe bolts, tighten the subframe bolts on the passenger side, get the splash shield back on, air box back in the top, and we should be ready for fluid. All right, got it back on the ground. Subframe is torqued, 76 foot-pounds. Now, Honda does say to replace the bolts, but we didn't. Got the splash shield back on. I'm going to wait to put the air box in until we fill it up with fluid. All right, got fluid in it. Now, I already did 2 drain and fills on this to see if that would help the noise, which it didn't. So I knew I had the correct fluid already. So all I did was measure what I captured, and that way I knew how much to start with putting back in. So I think we're ready to start. I think we did it. I don't hear any whining so far. Now we should really be able to tell I don't hear it. I think it's fixed. All right, well, success. I know it's kind of a unique repair, but I couldn't find any videos on how to do this and only a couple forum posts. So maybe this will help somebody down the road. We're not done with this thing yet. It'll be back. If you notice, the front end needs all new suspension, brakes, everything. So the owner just wanted me to see if we could fix that transmission noise before he dumped a bunch of money and getting this thing back on the road. But thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.